50 years after the Babylonian captivity, when the Babylonian Empire raided the kingdom of Judah, burned Jerusalem to the ground, leveled the Temple of Solomon the Wise. 50 years after political, military, and intellectual leaders of the land were taken into exile, they were allowed to return to their homeland. At the point in the story that we heard read today, Nehemiah has overseen the reconstruction of the security wall around the border of the city of Jerusalem, and the people cry out that this day needs to be acknowledged in some way. They call Ezra to bring out the Law of Moses, the books in the Bible that we call Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Now, it seems kind of far-fetched, listen to this reading, that the people would cry out to Ezra and say, "Oh, Ezra, read us the Torah." It seems much more likely that Ezra and Nehemiah would say, "Hey, the wall's completed. Don't you think the people ought to hear the Torah again?" and then assign everybody to show up. But it's important to note that's not the way it's worded in this passage. The people themselves are crying out to hear the word, the Law of Moses. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks describes this moment as the world's first adult education seminar. The Torah is read, but it is read so that all those who heard it could understand it. It's right there in the passage. Verse 2, it says, "All who could hear with understanding." Again, in verse 3, "and those who could understand." This is not some incantation, some kind of magic spell. This isn't a recitation of an ancient book in a foreign language nobody understands. It's important to know that the people hearing this ancient text are hearing it with interpretation to see where it intersects with their daily life. There alongside Ezra, we get this list of names: Yeshua, Bani, Sherebiah, Jamin, and others. These are the first small group leaders named in the Bible. They host the breakout groups, and they discuss the scripture passage in more depth. It says the people understood the reading with interpretation. Rabbi Sacks looks at this biblical precedent and the successive developments in the formation and the sustaining of Judaism, and he says that the Jewish people do something that no other religion has ever done: honing and refining a way of life capable of sustaining a nation in exile and dispersion for 2,000 years. Beginning with this reading and interpretation of the law at the Watergate, the Jewish people become the people of the book. No longer are they bound to living in a certain promised land. No longer are they required to keep all of the temple practices of the past. The religion changes so that some will live in that land and will continue to practice those ancient rites. But there's a transition so that other Jewish people who live throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond are able to practice this faith in their homes and in their synagogue and among foreign neighbors. Now jump ahead some 2,000 years. Martin Luther, the German monk, stands before the Diet of Worms in 1521, accused of heresy. Luther's called for reforms in the church because he's seen abuses of power by those who are selling indulgences. Indulgences are basically like get-out-of-jail-free cards that you could buy for your deceased loved ones who the priests were teaching were suffering for some indeterminate amount of time in a place called purgatory, and you could buy an indulgence and shorten their stay or get them out of purgatory. Luther thought that this was unfaithful to the gospel and thus made it much more difficult for the church to ever run any future capital campaigns, for the indulgences went to pay for St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. However, while not promising any indulgence, if anybody here has yet to turn in your pledge card for 2021, you can still do that online or in person. No gifts promised, though, for making that pledge. Luther was also concerned about the practice of the Lord's Supper. The Lord's Supper wasn't getting to everybody in the church anymore, and the practice of the Mass was spoken all in Latin, which was a language that very few people and almost no common people spoke throughout the European continent. Now, Luther's reforms that he calls for in the church, they didn't happen just on their own. They happened amidst a lot of sea change in how European life was conducted. The Holy Roman Empire was breaking apart into a collection of nation-states, each with their own political ruler, their own king. Capitalism as an economic system was beginning to take root. Technology was booming as the printing press expanded the spread of knowledge and information. And ships from Europe had begun exploring lands previously unknown to European citizens, and so it was even redefining their global structures and their cartography. The ground, almost literally, is shifting under the feet of the people as the world moves into this new season. And the church is one of those areas where adaptations have to be made. And whether he knows it or not, Martin Luther draws on this ancient history of Ezra and the people of Israel who returned to Jerusalem. Luther turns to the Bible. Now, Luther's Bible contains the Gospels of Jesus and some very important letters that weren't in the Torah of Moses, of course. But the idea of sharing the story with interpretation and understanding, that remains the same as what Ezra does at the Watergate. Looking into the Bible, Luther's reformation of the church shifts the religion in a way that people can respond to the present crises and needs as their political realities change, as their economic structures are challenged, as technology restructures the world around them. And so instead of a pope residing in Rome, the Holy Bible would become the guide for Christian living. The Bible would be more widely translated into the common language of the people. Worship, too, would adapt to fit those contexts as the language used in the worship service began to mirror the language spoken by the common people, and the proclamation of the word, the explanation and interpretation, the sermon, began to take precedent in the practice of the worship service. Above all, grace, the overwhelming power that moves the soul to freedom and grateful service, that would be the marker of Christian living, not keeping all the right ritual practices and observing all the correct penances. And so just as the Jews became the people of the book, allowing their faith to flourish in the midst of a diaspora, so the Christians were no longer centered in Rome with their episcopal government of priest and bishop and pope. Christians were able to structure their church life within these new nation states with the new economic and governmental structures within them and adapt to the technological changes that were around. Now, Luther has been labeled, because it's easy to just remember things when you do it this way. Luther's been labeled as the founder of the Reformation. But of course, the church has always been in reformations, and Luther's his own work wouldn't have been able to take root if it hadn't been for the common people widely dispersed who were crying out for a word to help them find order and structure to their life in this time. There are seismic shifts happening. The people need a guide, and the Bible, Luther lifts up, as the reliable source of God's wisdom and presence becomes the direction, just as it had for the Jewish people at the Watergate all those generations ago. Now, I hope it isn't too far of a stretch for us to consider what seismic changes have occurred in recent years that perhaps echo the uncertainties of these returned to Jerusalem exiles and the Europeans on the continent in the midst of reform. These folks face concerns about geographic location and political identity. Well, if you read the news or follow our own political life in our nation, there's not an agreed upon identity story these days of what it is to be an American person. Is America an idea founded by young political geniuses based on the best of wisdom and Enlightenment ideals that's brought opportunity to millions of people across generations and helped them to rise from a lowly state to one of success? Or is America a system of oppression as wealthy European nations stripped the continent of its native cultures, enslaved Africans to develop its wealth, and created a system that maximized the use of material natural resources to build capital at the detriment of other nations and the planet? Those are pretty different definitions of a country, and you could find them. You could find both of those in this room this morning. There's no agreed upon definition right now. Technology, too. So that we've got the political reality, we've got technology, too. We're only now beginning to understand, even at a very basic level, the power of major corporations, especially in the world of big tech, how those corporations are reshaping our political minds, our consumer desires, our relationships with other people. The power in these institutions is largely hidden from the surface as the technology far outpaces our ability to evaluate and understand the moral implications involved in its use. And then the economy. We have this thing now called the gig economy. Losses of manufacturing jobs, the rise of the service industry, agribusiness, international global competition, automation, virtual offices. People move from one city to the next, chasing a job instead of sticking with the same company over a career. Yeah, there's been some pretty significant economic change the last decade or so as well. And so we see, like we see with Nehemiah and in the time of Martin Luther, people around us looking for ways, how am I going to make sense of my life in this time? And it's been interesting to me to see where I've noted people turning to. I've noticed in social media circles, folks my age and those younger than me, a lifting up, once again, of astrology and of the zodiac signs. Astrological signs to impact their decisions, their work, their friendships. Bertram Moll, cognitive scientist at Brown University, wrote in an article for the Atlantic magazine about the rise of astrology. He said, "Astrology provides a powerful vocabulary to capture not only personality and temperament, but also life's challenges and opportunities. To the extent that one simply learns this vocabulary, it may be appealing as a rich way of representing, not explaining or predicting, human experiences and life events and identifying some possible paths of coping." As people's stress levels have risen in recent years, this system seems orderly, set in some cosmic system, and helps to provide reasons for my present feelings and hope for how to navigate the challenges that lay before me. Now, if signs of the zodiac seem a little too sci-fi for you, perhaps you've heard about the rising prominence of this thing called the Enneagram. It's risen in a lot of popularity in the last decade or so. It's a system of 9 personality types. It's got these wings and descriptions of what a person looks like in health or in unhealth. It gives people a way to understand how they respond to stress, how they experience love, how they need to be supported. For some adherents of it, it's an awfully dogmatic system, and often adhered to by people who refuse to accept any kind of religious dogma. Well, that's just because I'm a 7, you'll hear someone say, as though they are destined for some future outcome because of the number they're assigned on this circle, and they have no other choice. To my Christian ears, this sounds like an interesting interpretation of that doctrine that we often call predestination. Christopher Hewart's a 20-year adherent and teacher of the Enneagram. He says about it, "I usually try to say that the Enneagram is a sacred map of the soul. And you know this, the map isn't the journey. The map informs the journey. So if the Enneagram is a sacred map of our soul, if it is a compassionate sketch of possibilities of who we can become, then what it actually helps us do is excavate our essence." I'm not here today to eviscerate zodiac signs or the use of the Enneagram. In fact, I've used the Enneagram. I've found it to be helpful in my own life. But I point out the increased popularity of these things as evidence that there is a spiritual hunger that is around us. We're not just pre-programmed automatons simply seeking one momentary pleasure and the next. There's a feeling of anxiety, of uncertainty in this moment. And folks are looking, you can see it, looking for something reliable, stable, something cosmic even, that can help to navigate the next day, the next week, the next year. Isn't it our calling as Christian people to speak into that anxiety and that fear? Could the history we learn from Ezra and from Luther be a guide to tell the sacred story with interpretation so that it can be understood in the present moment? That's the shift religion always makes so that God's name and work continue to be known and displayed. So what does that look like for us? What does it mean to proclaim the good news in this moment? Well, here's my best attempt on Reformation Sunday 2020. We've all done things that we are not proud of. We've hurt other people. We've hurt ourselves. We've all suffered by the pain of someone else that we didn't deserve. And often we let these two stories control who we know ourselves to be. We live out of the guilt of our failings and our I'm not good enoughs, or we live in the shame and the trauma of the suffering that we did not encourage or deserve, and we stay stuck in that identity. And we live there to the point of exhaustion. That's a common thing. I think most a-religious person recognizes that they screw up a lot and they have endured a lot of pain and they get real tired. We get real tired. We're exhausted by our fear, by our failings, by the pettiness of our lives. And we realize that our work to try to make it better, follow this right plan, do this right thing, even accolades for the things that we do well, even the accolades seep out of us as those "you're not good enough" stories continue to penetrate our minds and our hearts. So as Christians, we say that there's this guy, his name's Jesus. And Jesus taught that there's this cosmic force, an order to the all-expanding universes, this force that ultimately defines each of us. And when we come to know that power in ourselves, it enables us to live differently, no longer trapped, enslaved by guilt, by shame, by trauma, by sorrow. We know this from the stories of Jesus in the Bible. He went around and he met people who were exhausted by their guilt, people who had suffered for no fault of their own, and he listened to their stories. And then he didn't offer them his latest self-help book or these 5 things or try to read the signs in the heavens for them. What he did, he forgave them. Forgave sins. And encouraged those people he met to live in this new way. And this new way of life was not one where we tried to understand our motivations or how we operated more from the inside. It was instead to turn our lives more outward and to extend to others this kind of self-giving love that Jesus shows to those he encounters. It was a way of bringing healing and pain to those we meet by also listening and offering forgiveness and words of encouragement. And what we find is as we do that for others, as we show that love for others, our own guilts, our own sorrows and shames begin to melt, fade away. And we too discover life that is new. But Jesus knew that we couldn't do that on our own. So he built this community to hold each other accountable to that way of love and to encourage one another to live that outward way of love together. And this community, us, the church, we gather around this collection of stories that help us to live this way. And there's a cast of characters in this book as diverse and weird and proud and bright and confused as any and all of you in this room or any of you all watching online today. And so as we read these stories of Scripture, they collide with our own story. So maybe you read it and you say, I feel a lot like a Miriam or a Paul, or like an Esther or a John, or I feel a lot of Peter in myself, or Samson or Moses. As we walk along with Jesus' love, we find these stories as a guide for our living that way of love together. And I can tell you, as someone who's tried to live that way for most of my life, and I can certainly tell you by people who've lived that way of love far more faithfully than I have, that this life of love together in the Jesus way, it brings genuine rest for weary souls. It gives purpose to a life that often feels trapped in nihilism. It gives us hope when the world feels like it's falling apart around us. And it gives us the ability to make it through even the most uncertain of times. So would you? Would you like to be part of that Reformation?